Good morning, Suidlanders. We trust you are well. Why do things feel skeef here for me? Something is not lining up, and if you know me, you know that it'll work on my nerves no end. Have I got a story for you? This was shared with me, given to me, by two people whom I regard separately as impeccable sources. I don't know for sure, anybody can be anybody, but it's two separate people from two very different circumstances who most certainly don't know one another, and of whom I have over time developed a high opinion. One is a self-made success in law, very successful. The other is a very, very successful high up senior person in, let's call it security. I don't typically get very nervous before a speech or a video or an interview, but I can hear my voice breaking and I'm half shaking, not in fear, but just some sort of nervous, I don't know. This is a thing and a half, this story. By the way, when I put this shirt on this morning, it was crisp, ironed crisply. Whew, it's hot. But we're fine, I had people sending me messages and advice and they want to help. And guys, really, I wasn't hinting. I'm not attempting to beg anything from anybody. I don't need help or favors. It's just hot, that's all. And I've gone off grid, and that's life. Imagine if I'd been born 3 generations ago. What would I have done without air conditioning then? So, let's get into this. Sworn statement. So, an affidavit. I, the undersigned, Fabiano Emanuel dos Santos, a Mozambican national, going by the name of Josh, do hereby state in English and under oath as follows. I was hired in the year 2000 by Mr. David Mabuza, who is now a premier in Mpumalanga province, to work for him and Mr. Steve Mabona, who was then a minister of police in Mpumalanga province. I was hired to be a cleaner for both of them. Being a cleaner means eliminating political and or business opponents of both Mr. Mabuza and Mr. Mabona. I was brought into Mpumalanga by Mr. Mabuza, who had requested Mr. Bobby Motaung of Kaiser Chiefs, Kaiser Motaung's son, to set up a meeting between the three of us, myself, Mr. Mabuza, and Bobby Motaung. By this time I was doing work for Mr. Motaung, which included cleaning up for him, facilitating the entry of drugs into South Africa, and arms and ammunition. After this meeting, I moved. Okay, so at this time I was doing work, and then I get introduced, to the next party, being David Mabuza, Deputy President of South Africa, in case that was lost on you. After this meeting, I moved to Mpumalanga to work for Mr. Mabuza, who then introduced me to Mr. Mabona. In 2000, I was instructed by Mr. Mabuza and Mr. Mabona to shoot and kill Mr. Fish Mahlalela, who was a minister in Mpumalanga. I was told that Mr. Mahlalela was causing problems for Mr. Mabuza and Mr. Mabona's businesses. A friend of mine warned me that Mr. Mahlalela had received military training in Angola and Russia, and that attacking him may be the end of me. I reported this to Mr. Mabuza and Mr. Mabona and told them that I could not go through with it. On that day, in my presence, at a farm in Elandshoek, near Ngodwana, Mr. Mabona phoned the Premier of that time, Mr. Mahlangu, and instructed him to remove Mr. Mahlalela from the cabinet. Mr. Mahlalela was saved assassination by being removed from the cabinet in the year 2000. Again in 2000, I was sent to KwaNdebele and spent 3 weeks monitoring a certain Mr. Msiza, who owned a driving school that was competing with Mr. Mabona's driving school. I eventually shot and killed Mr. Msiza in Kwaggafontein late in 2000. I was paid 10,000 rands for this job by Mr. Mabona. In the same year, Mr. Mabuza instructed me to plant drugs, mandrax and cocaine, at the home of Mr. Isaiah Khoza, who was a mayor of Nelspruit. The plan was to then inform Mr. Mabona, who was to send a team of policemen led by Captain Fanny Molapo to search Mr. Khoza's house and to arrest him. I planted the drugs as instructed, but Captain Molapo was ill at the time and the arrest did not go ahead. I don't know what happened to the drugs at Mr. Khoza's house in Nelspruit. In 2001, I was moved to Mr. Mabuza's farm in Barberton after they clashed with Mr. Mabona. Okay, so Mabuza and Mabona had a fallout. From this period, I did a lot of work for Mr. Mabuza and other businessmen. These included messes. It's still common in formal writing to use messes as the plural for misters, multiple males. But it's derived from French, and the irony of this super elegant English being employed by, oh dear, these include, I did a lot of work for Mr. Mabuza and other businessmen. These include Mrs. Bobby Motaung, Patrick Chirwa, and Herbert Teledi. The work that I was doing involved smuggling drugs, buying dagga in bulk for Mr. Mabuza, poisoning certain individuals, and carrying out murder hits. Between 2000 and 2009, I moved from Elandshoek Farm and Mr. Mabuza's farm in Barberton while carrying out my work. People that I was personally involved in either poisoning, planting illegal substances in their homes, and carrying out hits on them are as follows. James Nkambule. There's a whole story about how he poisoned him, but he didn't die. Mr. or Andries Gamede. He eventually had a crisis of conscience and warned the aforementioned Andries Gamede. Mr. Isaiah Khoza. Just to be clear, these are all at the behest of David Mabuza. I'm leaving out, otherwise this would be a 45-minute video. But on David Mabuza's instructions, your deputy president's instructions, he poisons one guy, he doesn't die. He doesn't poison another guy, he panics and warns him. He plants drugs, but the captain with whom they had an arrangement, with whom David Mabuza had an arrangement to raid the house, was ill. Fish Matlalela. You've already heard the story of Fish Matlalela, but it gets better. So he tells it twice in the same affidavit. After Mr. Matlalela was removed as a minister in Mpumalanga, Mr. Mabuza instructed me in 2003 to arrange a certain Mr. Britain Fagude. Britain Fakude or Fagude. You know, in some black languages in South Africa, when written, a K is pronounced like a G because the languages are very nuanced. There's more than one sound for what we see as one sound. Very subtle. Louis Hutton could tell you more than I can. To arrange a certain Mr. Britain Fakude, who works at correctional services, to befriend Mr. Matlalela's wife, known as Faith. This was after I had arranged an HIV positive prostitute to sleep with Fagude. Mr. Fagude complied and had sex with Mr. Matlalela's wife at a room at Road Lodge, Nelspruit. The aim was to break Mr. Matlalela's marriage and to infect him with HIV. Mr. Fagude still maintains a relationship with Mr. Matlalela's wife and was guaranteed protection by Mr. Mabuza. Mr. Msiza. I was instructed by Mr. Mabuza and Mr. Mabona in 2000 to kill Mr. Msiza from Kwandebele, who owned a driving school, because he refused to sell his business to them. I shot and killed him in late 2000, and Mr. Mabona paid me 10,000 rands. In 2004 or 2005, Mr. Patrick Chirwa and a young man who was introduced as Spusiso Skudla from Ermelo came in one night with the body of a dead man. I was instructed by both Mr. Chirwa and Mr. Mabuza, who arrived later, to dig a grave and bury the man, which I did. This was on Mr. Mabuza's Elandshoek farm. I overheard a conversation between Mr. Chirwa, Mr. Sigudla, and Mr. Mabuza that Mr. Chirwa will drive the dead man's car into Malawi and make it look like the man vanished into Malawi. During the same period, 2 bodies of men were brought for burial by Mr. Bobby Motaung, son of Kaiser Motaung of Kaiser Chiefs fame, accompanied by Mr. Mabuza, David Mabuza, Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa. I buried these bodies at Mr. David Mabuza's Elandshoek farm. Mbombela operation. Oh, this is quite a long thing. So he's told to recruit 4 guys, and then he's given a list of 5 people whom he must assassinate. He recruits the 4 guys, 3 from Zimbabwe and 1 from Mozambique. And they get promised 40,000 rand per person per hit. So that's 200,000 rand hit times 5 is 1 million rand, will be the cost to Deputy President David Mabuza. Then he wasn't Deputy President, but he is now, you know what I mean. They get 100,000 rand deposit. We followed Mr. Mohlala, that's their first victim, into his house, and I shot him twice or thrice. He was with a child who was shot by Armando, one of his recruited accomplices, the guy from Mozambique. He was with a child who was shot by Armando, while I had to make sure that Mr. Mohlala was dead. This was in January 2009. I called Mr. David Mabuza and told him the job was done. Mr. David Mabuza sounded very happy upon hearing this news. We retreated back to Mr. Mabuza's farm in Barberton, whereupon he told me that we must move to his Elandshoek farm until the rest of our money was settled. He told me the rest of our money will be paid sooner. He also told me to shake Mr. Chiwayo, another one of the intended victims, with threats on his phone, which numbers Mr. Mabuza gave me. I threatened Mr. Chiwayo on his phone at least 5 times. In August 2009, while on my way back to Elandshoek from Nelspruit, a lady friend called on my cell and told me never, it's written here in block capital letters, or typed, to return to Elandshoek because my other 4 colleagues had been executed at the farm by 2 men in the presence of Mr. David Mabuza and Mr. Bobby Motaung, son of Kaiser Motaung of Kaiser Chiefs fame. Scared, I asked her what to do, and she advised me to travel to Barberton and tell Mr. James Nkambule everything, including that we were to attack him on or before the 15th of August 2009. Afraid and tired of the killings, I went to Barberton on August the 13th, 2009, where I asked to speak to Mr. James Nkambule, and I told him everything. Mr. Nkambule asked if I had a problem writing all I told him, and I said no problem. I wrote it down. An old man who spoke both Portuguese and Tsonga was brought in, and he translated to me in Portuguese and Tsonga. In other words, translated back to him what is typed here, what I am reading to you. Well, this is now the affidavit, but you're going to see why it's fundamentally the same document in a minute. The typed statement, which was exactly what I had said. After making a number of calls, I was taken to Swaziland. I asked Mr. Nkambule to get me indemnity from prosecution. I faked my death. My aunt told a man who came looking for me that I'd committed suicide and showed him a fake death certificate and my uncle's grave as mine. The statement was read to me in Portuguese and Tsonga. Done on this 13th day of August 2009 at Barberton, signed Dos Santos and commissioned by Commissioner of Oaths Cleopas Vuyani Nkambule. So presumably it's the same guy. That guy, whoever he was that was meant to be assassinated, was somehow also a Commissioner of Oaths. And so he handled the whole thing properly. That is who rules South Africa. And the worst is, if this is true, it could be a fake. Anything could be a fake nowadays. We live in the new South Africa, the Rainbow Nation, my angels. But we're repeating it not necessarily as true, but we feel as if we're on safe ground, given, number one, that it comes from various sources. Number two, that to the naked eye, as it were, it must be true. If I brought you a document and you saw that it had been commissioned under oath, why would you then assume that it was false? Otherwise, every document you ever had to read, you have to hire Sherlock Holmes to check. At some point, you have to believe. And there's no reason not to believe. And indeed, City Press newspaper believes it. Because they have just in the past few minutes, broken a story about this. They broke the story after I began making this video. So within the past 20 minutes. And after, necessarily, obviously, after I got my 2 copies of that apparent affidavit. And the best of all is that Cyril Ramaphosa had to have known. There's no way that he didn't know. So what do you think we should do? I know, let's make him the deputy president. This is the African NC after all. Murdered lots of people, sold lots of drugs to children, had children murdered, poisoned many people. Make him the premier, make him the president, the deputy president. And you still find people in Johannesburg and in this dorp, in Van der Kloof of all places, who disagree with our politics. What is there to disagree with? What a businessman in this town told me, I disagree with your politics. What is there to disagree with? Look around you, see for yourself what's going on. You have to be a Suidlander. You can't not be a Suidlander. You must be a Suidlander. You must believe that the trajectory of the Republic of South Africa is not sustainable without a crisis, without a catastrophic termination, without a collision between an immovable object and an unstoppable force. Thus resulting in the pulverizing of both. Ay, 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 ay. And now this, I'm just seeing something else here. I'm going off track. If you don't want to hear about this, feel free to skip or whatever. Oscar Pistorius has got a parole hearing because he has served half of his 15-year sentence. He murdered a beautiful young woman and he got 15 years for it. Now that he's served half, he wants to get out. Seriously, I don't understand. I do not understand. Anyway. Guys, thank you very much for watching this video. It's mind-boggling. I'm telling you, my brain is all over the show. May our Lord bless and keep you in the times that most assuredly lie ahead of us. Bye-bye.